Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to this exciting conversation on nutrition transition in Africa, hosted by the Aspen Initiative in Nairobi. And a bit about the Aspen Institute. For those of you who are just joining us, the Aspen Institute has existed for the last 74 years and drives change through dialogue, leadership, and action to help solve the greatest challenges of our time. At the Aspen Initiative Africa in Nairobi, we foster enlightened leadership that makes a moral and intellectual contribution to the development of society in Africa and worldwide. My name is Mokui, and from the Aspen Initiative in Africa, Nairobi, and we're so delighted and we welcome you to join us in this webinar. And we're so excited to have our panelists, our distinguished panelists with us today. So I'll just go ahead and introduce who will be on our panel today. So our panel will be moderated by Dr. Richard Aya, and he's a medical doctor who is an expert in health policy and health systems management. He has a PhD in public health governance, and he's a director and chair of the Center for Health Solutions Kenya and a director at the University of San Francisco, Kenya, which supports research in Kenya. He has consulted for the Ministry of Health, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and others, and he has published widely, including the books Introduction to Public Health and Community Resource Recipes for Everyday Healthy Living. Thank you so much, Dr. Aya, for moderating today's session. And next, we have Dr. Hiba Osei Kwasi. And Dr. Osei Kwasi is a public health nutrition academic. She has a BSc in community nutrition from the University of Development Studies in Ghana. She obtained a master's degree with distinction in nutrition and rural development from Ghent University in Belgium, and a PhD in public health nutrition from the University of Sheffield. Upon completion of her PhD, she took up a research associate position at the University of Sheffield, where she worked on global public health nutrition projects in Ghana and Kenya, exploring the food environment and the dietary transitions in Africa. Dr. Osei Kwasi has been awarded the prestigious AXA postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Sheffield to explore the culinary practices of African immigrant women in Greater Manchester and their readiness to prevent overweight and obesity. And she joined Loughborough University as a lecturer in 2022, where she's an international special envoy to Sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Dr. Osei Kwasi, to this conversation. Next, we have Dr. Marie Bragg. She has a doctorate in clinical psychology, and she's an assistant professor at the New York University in the Department of Population Health section on health choice, policy, and evaluation. She has a joint appointment at the NYU College of Public Health. Her recent studies have examined the food and beverage industry's advertising practices, among other interpersonal and social factors that influence dietary preferences. Dr. Bragg is a Food Leaders Fellow under the Aspen Food and Society Program and has also testified on various food policy proposals to the New York City Council, the New York State Assembly, and the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Welcome, Dr. Bragg. And last but not least, we have Professor Barry Popkin, and Professor Popkin developed the concept of nutrition transition, which we'll be discussing today, and which is the study of the dynamic shifts in our environment and the way they affect dietary intake and physical activity patterns and trends, and obesity and other nutrition-related non-communicable diseases. His research program focuses globally, both in the US, in low and middle income countries, on understanding the shifts in stages of the transition and programs and policies to improve the population health linked with this transition. He is now actively involved in global work on the program, policy design, and evaluation side to reduce demand for unhealthy food and increase that for healthy, minimally processed and real food. He's a pioneer and a luminary in this field, and Professor Popkin has published over 640 referred journal articles, and he's been rated as one of the top cited scholars among 7 million scholars in the world. So thank you so much, Dr. Popkin, for joining us, Professor Popkin. And before I hand it over to our moderator, I just like to go through some housekeeping for you to participate in the webinar. We have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can ask questions to any of the panelists. And as the conversation continues, we will try and capture all your questions. And we may not get to every single question, but we'll try to cover every topic. And you can also use the chat button if you'd like to chat with any of the participants or the other guests. We would love for you to share your thoughts on this webinar on social media with the handle, with the hashtag inspiring change. And our social media handles are Aspen Africa on X, formerly Twitter, and Aspen Initiative Africa on LinkedIn. So thank you very much. And I will hand this over to Dr. Aya to take us into the conversation.
And I think we'll get on right with it, huh? So I'll start with Dr. Hopkins, Professor Popkins, in terms of asking him just to talk a little bit about the nutrition transition, just to give us an overview in terms of what is the concept of nutrition transition and just how does it play out at the global level.
The nutrition transition is really speaking of a process and change in how we eat, how we drink, and how we move, and how that's shifted over many hundreds of years. But most particularly, people think of the transition when they think of the rapid changes undergoing in diet and movement in low and middle income countries. And when we think and move that to Africa, we've shown in one paper we published 3 or 4 years ago how the transition in food processing has really shifted in the last 50 years across all the different countries in Africa. And we cite many, many examples, and how the shift in the processing has led people to eat a lot more food high in added sugar, sodium, and saturated fat, so too much salt. And at the same time, movement has changed. So in Africa, this is played out in 2 ways. Not only has overweight, obesity increased, and all the new diet-related non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancers, and so forth, but it's also played out in the slow reduction in undernutrition in the region, and how in some cases the infants today are being fed highly processed junk food, which the same as adults and others are consuming, and this has accelerated the stunting and undernutrition on a subpopulation in Africa. So we see both sides of this happening in Africa, but really what we're concerned with in this webinar is the shift toward diet-related diseases that's very much caused by the ways we've changed how we eat and drink in particular.
Can already think of some questions. You're saying, like, is the shift inevitable?
The shift is inevitable in the following ways. With urbanization, with the enormous shift in the roles of women into the marketplace in more formal sector jobs and more away from home positions, time for preparation of food is much reduced, and so ready to eat and ready to heat highly processed food is highly attractive. So that's been one element. At the same time, as incomes increased, along with that urbanization, people buy richer food. They can afford to buy more, and they are. And be it those corn-based dishes, the cornmeal dishes of Kenya and East Africa, or others, people are adding more salt to them. They're adding more sugar and unhealthy saturated fats, red palm oil. And this is really affecting this a lot. So it is inevitable in the way people have reacted to economic change, and how economic change has reduced time for home food preparation. And enhanced leisure with TV and social media and other things. So people really don't want to spend as much time preparing food.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I just want to bring in Dr. Osei Kwasi into the conversation in terms of the work that you have been doing, both particularly in Africa.
Yeah.
Just how is the nutrition transition playing out?
All right. Thank you so much. I'd first of all like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers, and I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I feel really honored to be with Professor Popkins and the whole team, because throughout my career, I'm still an early career researcher. There is no single paper that I don't cite Professor Popkins. So I just wanted to acknowledge him for, the significant contributions he's made towards this research area. I'm just going to share, I'm aware of time, a couple of findings from studies that I was involved in. So one of them, it's the nutrition transition, the dietary transitions in African cities. This is research we undertook a couple of years ago. It was a collaboration between universities in UK and Ghana and Kenya. At the time I was in Sheffield. It was led by one Professor Michelle Holsworth. And so the whole idea was to leverage evidence for interventions and policies to prevent NCDs in Africa. Now, we set out with three main objectives, to assess the current food consumption and dietary practices in African cities, and to examine factors in the urban food environments that drove, the food consumption patterns that we were observing. We did so many studies, at a local level. We did systematic reviews. We did something called photo voice. We did GIS mapping. I'm just going to share two examples of those studies to answer that question. Now, we first of all did a systematic review with meta-analysis to look at the evidence based on what the food consumption patterns were. We hypothesized that energy and fat consumption levels were going to be very high in relative to the WHO recommended nutrient intake goals. We looked at studies specifically in Ghana and Kenya because those two countries are at the advanced stage of the nutrition transition. And we had 47 studies in all. What were the main findings? Relatively high consumptions of unhealthy foods and drinks, particularly sugar-sweetened beverages, among a quarter of the sample. The sample that's, from the systematic review. Animal source foods, including dairy, red meat, processed meat, eggs, and fish were consumed by a high proportion of the population in both countries, and there was low consumption of fruits and vegetables, with almost half of the population studied reporting no consumption of these foods at all. Now, that's just briefly what the systematic review showed. Now, we also did another study, to add on to the systematic review, where we did a qualitative 24-hour dietary recall in three settings, three cities in two countries. So in Ghana, it was in Accra and Ho. Ho is also in Ghana, and in Kenya, it was in Nairobi. We looked for low socioeconomic communities in these countries, again, to look at how unhealthy foods and drinks are embedded in their everyday life. So we look at all of the food and drinks that were consumed in and outside of their home. We assessed the nutrient content. We also went on to look at, time of the day that those foods are consumed, how long an eating episode lasts, who they were eating with, and where they were eating these foods. So again, quickly, I'm going to show you what the findings were. I'm going to tell you what the findings were. So we found evidence of unhealthy diets in all of these, communities we studied. However, the consumption of the unhealthy foods and beverages were operating in different ways between those communities that we studied. Yes, there was a high consumption of all of these unhealthy foods we talk about, but it operated differently. So in Kenya, we observed that there was a high intake of sweet foods and sugar-sweetened beverages. About 3/4 of their intakes, were sweet foods and sugar-sweetened beverages, whereas in Ghana, the issue was with fried foods. So there was high consumption of fried foods as opposed to the sweet foods and sugar-sweetened beverages that we observed in Kenya. Another key finding from that study was, a lot of the times we talk about street food contributing to the nutrition transition. This was not often cited as a contributing factor in those communities that we studied. Apart from that, we also did a GIS mapping study. So we wanted to see, we did an audit of the community where these participants lived. So we tried to characterize the foods that were sold and the adverts, within that were available in those communities that we studied using GIS mapping. So yeah, we looked at the food outlets and the advertising that was also ongoing. Now, almost half of all the advertisements were for sugar-sweetened beverages, so close to 50%. And then there was a bit of 1/3 of the adverts were also alcoholic drinks. There was high availability of sugar-sweetened beverages, like 40%, as well as processed foods. And then there was also really availability of healthy foods as well. So the point I'm trying to make with this is that, yes, there was unhealthy foods, processed foods, but there was also high availability of healthy, what we would term as healthy foods, your whole foods, fresh fruits, cereals, and grains in these communities we studied. I think I'll pause here. So that's the answer to the question you asked me. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I want to bring in Dr. Bragg as well, because in terms of giving us a bit about the US experience, every time another fast foods company comes into Kenya, at least, it's lauded as one more example of private investment, and we're counting the number of branches of whether it is a KFC or any one of these. It said, we're doing well when we attract foreign investment into the country. But that's an aside. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what your work is showing about what are the current trends in the US in terms of the problem and also the other countries that you've worked in. Dr. Bragg?
Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. It's really exciting to hear from my colleagues, and in both of the comments about advertising. So the GIS study, I love that study, and in the advertisement piece of that, plus this discussion of transitioning to ready-to-heat and ready-to-eat foods really helps capture and set the stage for the work that I've been doing. So we know that people don't transition to new kinds of foods in a vacuum. So my interest was always, okay, who are the players who are shaping diet? And one of the things that stood out to me in the early days of getting started in this work was that Coca-Cola, for example, in the early 2000s, spent about $5.5 billion US marketing throughout Africa. A decade after that, the subsequent decade, they spent $17 billion. So when we think about what is producing the change towards these sugary beverages or towards these ready-to-eat products, we also have to consider the marketing dollars that go into shaping the preferences of young people who are the next generation of consumers, but also among families, and whether it's women who are entering the workforce and sort of moving outside of the home. And so I really wanted to see, okay, who's spending the money and where is it going? And so in some of our studies, we saw the results of that. So in one study that when we were in Ghana, in Accra, we saw that the majority of advertisements in our study were for sugar-sweetened beverages. And we actually didn't see much alcohol, but we did see some coffee, some water, but the majority was full calorie Coca-Cola or a little bit of Pepsi. And so when we think about what is driving change, we want to be thinking of the corporate influences and how they are shaping diet. In another study, we wanted to examine social media, because now companies have the ability to create their own Instagram accounts or that are specific to each country. So if you were to Google Coca-Cola Australia or any country. So they often have an account dedicated to specific countries. And in that study, we saw that in lower income countries, we saw more frequent price giveaways. And so that might be things like cell phone minutes or, just other incentives for free giveaways or price promotions in lower middle income countries. And we saw higher portrayals of things like vegetables or salads in higher income countries. And so, the incredible thing is all of those social media accounts really work hard to capture local culture and holidays and really infuse themselves into traditions in ways that are unprecedented. Okay,
so there's this idea that the fast food companies really get into our culture in terms of really just being a part of our culture. I'm lucky in a way that in our family, Dr. Popkins entered in our family really early in terms of our papers because my wife then has a background in public health nutrition. So when my kids were born, we started off knowing about this nutrition transition, about nutrition. But I guess for many, many people, they don't have that privilege. So Dr. Popkins, this sounds like a really bad thing. What are some of the solutions, potential solutions that we can adopt?
So my program, our research group, really is kind of the leader globally on working with countries to try to reduce consumption of these highly processed and ultra-processed food, and at the same time increase consumption of real and minimally processed food. So the way we're doing this, for example, in South Africa, where we work, in Kenya, they added sugary beverage taxes, a health promotion levy, it was called, in South Africa, which had an enormous impact on reducing consumption among South Africans of sugary beverages. In other countries, we're working there, and South Africa soon will institute a front of the package label warning system, which will ban all sorts of claims on food and change how the food products look, getting rid of characters and other things on them, and really have a significant impact, as we've shown in other countries. Other places we're working on, we've instituted marketing bans, complete marketing ban in Chile. First, we did it only for children's programs, but we found the advertisements were shifting to adult programs and kids were watching them. So we did a complete ban, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. And we're working on that and on schools. For example, in Brazil, there are 60 million kids who get school programs of one sort or another, and it's from age 2 to 18. And with these national feeding programs, we've shifted it so 75% of the food must be real, 5% can be minimally processed ingredients, spices and such, and the other 20% could be ultra processed food. So that essentially we've shifted the diet from these catered, highly processed food meals to real food at lunches in that country. And these are examples. On the other side, we're working in several countries in Latin America, testing out apps that will be used to give low-income people money and to be used only to go to selected farmer markets in their area to buy real food, particularly fruits and vegetables. In these countries, other countries, it could be legumes, and it will be seasonally appropriate fruits and vegetables only. So we'll have shifted, the app will shift over the year. So these are the efforts countries are working on. In Kenya today, they're considering a front of the package labeling. I'm not involved in it yet, although our group will be getting involved in Africa much more in the next 5 years. And they're considering this in several other countries in Africa, Ethiopia and others. What will come out depends on how strong the advocates are versus how strong industry is. And this is always a problem. Industry fights us continuously on any regulation that will create healthy eating. But Coke can sell water as easily as they can sell sugary beverages. So they don't necessarily lose money and employment when we institute healthier food. They can produce healthier food if they're forced to do it. It will cut their profit margins in some cases because the food that they produce now is really pulled apart almost to the molecular level and reconstituted. So if you buy a chip from a stand in a box, that chip, if it's from an African country that hasn't really instituted the modern high processing, it may be real corn. But if you buy it from most of the supermarkets, you'll get this highly processed item that if you saw it during the processing, it would look like sawdust. And then it comes back and they reconfigure it to look like a chip. So we're being faced with this, and this is accelerating, and it's these foods which are accelerating now the problem, and that's why we're working so hard with countries, lobbying them, supporting advocacy groups. Our group provides research to try to institute healthier food policies, and we're doing this across all the low and middle income regions.
Just before we leave the topic of what seems to be working, are there some examples of what does not work?
Yes, voluntary regulations that industry institute have never been shown to work. Positive logos that say this is a healthier food don't have any impact. We have to get rid of the ultra-processed food and replace it if we're going to really have a healthier world in the future.
And building on that, I think that advertising healthy foods is not a solution either. One of the most frequent questions I get is, well, can we advertise for fruits and vegetables? They don't have the budgets to compete with a $17 billion annual marketing campaign. And so the idea that we're going to counter market, in ways that are going to beat Coke or Pepsi is too much of a long shot. So exactly what Dr. Popkin is saying, we need to get the bad stuff out.
In terms of what doesn't work, a lot of the times the evidence also shows that we focus on individual level determinants. So we always do it education, and even though that helps, the evidence shows that it doesn't get anywhere. So we really need to go beyond focusing on the individual level determinants to address this from the level that Professor Popkins has mentioned.
Yeah, which is addressing the whole food environment. What we haven't done yet, and we're beginning to think about, is how we can also address corporations directly, change their portfolios, minimize what they can do, and so forth. And that's a much bigger issue requiring more global solutions. But we're going to have to come there someday if the planet's going to get healthier. Right now, we're creating more and more unhealthy people across the globe with our food.
I'd just like to circle back to, we started off by talking about the nutrition transition. I think it wasn't quite clear to me what the problem is right at the end. And I know we talked about a little bit about obesity and so on, and about trying to prevent NCDs. I think we assume that everybody is unhappy with growing bigger and so on. I watch, say, rugby, and everybody's sort of 1 foot more than they were a generation ago, and so on. So I wonder whether, we have tackled what is the problem. Fine, we know what is the nutrition transition, but
okay,
what is the problem?
Let me add something. The US, which is the highest consumer of ultra-processed foods, we're getting shorter. All our basketball players are now coming from Africa and Europe that are tall.
Is that why they're coming from Congo? Okay.
That we are actually getting shorter because we're eating less protein and we're eating so much of this ultra-processed food. So, but that's only one problem. We are seeing in China, life expectancy is starting to go down. We're going to start to see it in my country as well. So in many countries with these shifts going on, we're ultimately going to create, and it's not only reducing life expectancy, more important, we're seeing more and more people who are older, who are debilitated. They can't move, they can't go to the ground and stand up. They really have a lot of physical disabilities. So we're creating a society which may live, may grow taller in the case of the children if they're fed enough protein and so forth, which is what's been happening. But they are going to be unhealthy when they get older. And it's not just a matter of dying from 13 of the 16 cancers, which are related to diet and obesity, but it's the debilitation, which is much worse. So diabetics with losing a leg, eye, or just not being able to move, you'll start to see more and more people being pushed around in wheelchairs and such. This is what's happening in my world, and also the UK and Australia, the three countries leading the world in obesity and ultra-fat people. So we have to realize this transition is about healthy living until we die.
Can I just add on to what?
Yes.
Yes, just wanted to add on to why it is important. I was listening to a podcast recently, so I would say this is anecdotal evidence because I haven't read it anywhere. But then there's evidence to show that if we are not careful, the children we are giving birth to today will not even outlive their parents and grandparents, because we are seeing early onsets of diabetes and all of these diseases and NCDs that used to really start later on, when people got older. So that's another problem. We might have children who would die even before their parents or grandparents if we continue at this rate.
And one of the challenging pieces about this, I'd love to hear from all of you. One of the challenges I encounter is the fear factor of diet-related diseases seems to sometimes among audiences that I speak to not be as strong or as palpable as, say, deaths related to gun violence or other really serious public health problems. And so one of the challenges I think wrapped up in this is how do we create a sense of urgency about this problem because of the because of the NCDs, but maybe we'll revisit that later. But that had me thinking of that topic too.
I think we're onto that, Dr. Bragg, because I mean, there's this problem in public health that we tend to cause a lot of fear and tell people this will happen, this will be bad, this will be bad. But it's a trend, and it's sort of a slow trend in terms of it's what you do daily, but then the effects come out much, much later. So I'm just wondering if you have some lessons that we can learn out of say the US that can be adopted into Africa. I mean, one thing that just caught my attention was what Dr. Popkin talked about, increasing taxes. And right now on the streets of Nairobi, we have Gen Z on the streets talking about we don't want higher taxes. So I'm just imagining with the culture infused when they realize that their sodas are being taxed more. Are there any examples that we can talk about that we can get from out of the US into?
Yeah, the only example in the US really is the taxation, and it's only done in several municipalities. We truly, as a country, right now are considering putting warning labels on food with our Food and Drug Administration, but the US, because of the huge size of the food sector here, and so many of the global companies are parented here, they really control a lot of our Congress, and it makes it very difficult to institute in this country healthy food policies. But we've been able to overcome that in so many countries. We just haven't been able yet to overcome it in this country. And I think it's really because low and middle income countries like Mexico and Colombia, Brazil, South Africa are worried about the health cost and are worried about the health problems, and they can't afford to face it. We haven't faced yet the fact that 17 to 20% of our income goes to healthcare. And because we're so unhealthy, and because we have a private sector system instead of a public system. But other countries can't afford that. They have Social Security in many countries that provides health care to many, many people. And they're going broke by the increases in diabetes and hypertension, all the disease problems. So I think that's why we're seeing in low and middle income countries the need to deal with this. The health costs will really drive out, and it's not just the health costs. If you become overweight, and you may not realize this, even in an office, your productivity goes by down by 20 to 30% from studies that have been done. I'm an economist, PhD in economics, and the economists who have studied this show significant reductions in productivity across all groups if they become overweight and obese. So this is an economic issue as well as a health issue for countries.
I've got a question for Dr. Osei-Kwasi, because you mentioned that you're also dealing with migrant communities as well. And that's one of the communities that we who live in Africa, we look to as the diaspora, and we look out for them. We want their remittances and so on. I wonder whether there's anything in terms of solutions, the problem and solutions.
So the problem isn't any different, this nutrition transition we are seeing, the dietary transitions. There's a study that was conducted by a group of researchers led by Charles Agyemang in the Netherlands. He compared Ghanaians living in 3 European cities, London, Amsterdam, and Berlin, and compared them with Ghanaians living in rural and urban Ghana. And he realized that, well, the studies showed that these things we are talking about, were happening. The trend was higher as you went to the more urbanized area. So it was people were eating more processed foods, more animal protein foods here in the West, as you would expect, as compared to urban Ghana, and then as compared to rural Ghana. So I went on to do some qualitative studies to try and understand, what were the drivers of these behaviors. Now, a lot of the Ghanaians I spoke to told me, because they were better off now, they wanted to eat more animal protein. Most of them had come from places where it was difficult at the time to be able to have enough meat on your plate. So now that they found themselves in better economic position, they were eating more of those animal proteins. One striking finding is the fact that they still maintained their traditional diets. So again, they were not succumbing to fast foods, the street food, as in the case of the majority UK population. Within the Ghanaian community that I've studied, people were still eating their traditional diets, except they were including a lot more of the proteins and all of these things that are, eating in excess could give us problems. So your question was about solutions. The problem is not that they are eating out of home. They are eating their own foods, So this is where my research is now going to focus on. I have just put in an application to work with the communities. I'm focusing on West African immigrants. We do know the issues. People know. That's why I said education doesn't work, because people are aware. So I feel like we need to move away from that deficit approach, which is what we tend to do, telling people to eat healthy and to cook healthier meals. Everybody knows the importance of eating healthy meals. We don't know what works, to be honest, within the ethnic minority population. So what we are trialing now is I've just had a PhD studentship to look at positive deviance. So within the community, the immigrant community, who are the people doing things well, right? Beyond those, because they all experience the same issues. All of them tend to live in poorer areas, but there will be some people who are able to overcome these challenges. So I am now trying to learn from those people, because I want to make a difference. And I know that that difference should come from all levels, policy levels, government levels. And so at my own, small level, I want to try and understand what is working right within these immigrant communities and possibly use that to develop interventions or, put that into policies for government to follow. But at the moment, I can't tell you that I know of anything that works for the immigrant population. They're still on that trajectory we are observing across the world. And it's really bad, affecting their health in a negative way.
Mm.
I don't know if Barry knows
Yeah.
anything that I don't know.
Dr. Bragg, you want to add anything to that?
One of the up-and-coming policies that we are studying and we're just funded by our National Institutes of Health to examine is evaluating social media restrictions in the United States. And so there are now about 40 states that have either proposed or enacted policies that are designed to restrict social media use among young people and or restrict advertising that targets young people. And there is support across the political spectrum for these kinds of social media policies in many areas because a lot of parents, no matter sort of their political background, are concerned about some of the mental health effects of social media. And so some of these policies offer a really novel opportunity to understand how this might contribute to the equation of getting junk food ads away from kids. And so I think that's where these policies are rolling out now. And so we don't know how effective they are going to be, but I wanted to raise it because it's something I think worth revisiting on a panel like this in a few years, and when we see our kids still getting onto social media and seeing junk food ads. And the reason that that's concerning is because we know that when kids see junk food ads, they're more likely to consume more calories compared to when kids see non-food ads. And so many experimental studies have demonstrated that in lab settings. And so if we can pull those junk food ads out of social media, it's not a magic bullet, but it will reduce what they're seeing overall.
One of the things about social media that people don't understand is that these companies invested billions of dollars in creating databases. They have on each child more data than you can imagine. They know often what their parents do and buy, what the kids look at across all different social media. And they learn about their preferences and they feed it. And they use that data to create very individualized programs focused on each kid, games, other things that they use. And this is becoming one of the most powerful elements today for modern global food companies. And it uses our privacy. It invades the privacy of the family completely. And only in Europe right now, in Western Europe, the EU is working to control this and control the amount of data that can be held by these companies and so forth. But across the rest of the world, it's being ignored. And until we get legislation on it, really on what they control in data, on privacy laws and so forth, it's going to be very difficult to stop them. And we've created laws. UK actually has a law that is the strongest we know globally, but it wasn't implemented. It was done during Boris Johnson's early period when he had COVID and was afraid his overweight and obesity had almost killed him. And so he came after this. And the law was created, but then they stopped. And they were going to move to a warning label also. I had been working with the Department of Health there. And both of these were stopped after Boris's political problems. But the point is, we need to attack this directly. We need to attack through privacy. We need to deal with them and create. And we haven't learned yet how to create really perfect laws, but the EU way of attacking their databases and their privacy is certainly a critical start.
I'd just like us to switch just a little bit in terms of what we have been discussing. There are a couple of questions on the Q&A, and one of them brings up something which is directly related, which is, this is from Zainab Kangale, and first of all, it will be addressed to Dr. Popkins, and then we open it up. And that is, there's an issue about processed foods and the cost of preparing them. So in the sort of more traditional way of thinking, there's people are fuel deficient. So I'll just mention some research that we did around climate change in the slums of Nairobi, and we found that families were frying foods more simply because it was too expensive to boil stuff, both in terms of time and in terms of the cost of fuel. So fried foods then start to come in urban areas. So how do we moderate that? It may be there's what we wish, but there's sort of the reality of it particularly in urban areas. So that's the question about food preparation.
Yeah. Our program works with Carolina for Kibera, which we started, which is all over the Kibera slum, with health outlets, dozens of them, and so forth. And yes, we've really seen this increase. And it's a very complex one, because until we have reusable power that people can use in other ways, people are using gas and other things, and it's expensive, propane and so forth. So this is a complex global issue, which is only going to come when our countries really begin to figure out how to use renewables and then reduce the cost of them and make them available to low-income people in subsidized ways, perhaps. It's a big part of climate, and it's as well as health. And this interplay between the two is quite significant.
Yeah, Dr. Bragg, the US experience, the fact that in terms of processing foods, the issue of time and cost of fuels is a big factor.
I see. Yes.
So just trying to compare.
That's right. This is not quite my area of expertise, but I do. One of the things that we found in our studies was the sensitivity to these price promotions, and the idea that companies are sort of packaging their products with more price promotions and giveaways in lower income countries. And so so the piece about fuel I can't speak to at all. But the company is sort of being aware of which consumers are going to be more price sensitive, and how to sort of exploit that is something we have observed in our data, in the sense of it being part of their promotional packages in ways that they don't do in our country.
So it's just price in terms of promoting foods that are more processed, that'll be easier for low-income people to buy. Yeah.
And this is why we're seeing more and more ready-to-eat food, be it street food that you buy and has already been processed, so the street vendors handle the fuel costs and so forth, or in the stores, and or in the vendors that sell all the packaged foods. And so all these different sources really are trying to save time as well as money. And so, that's why more ready-to-eat food is becoming quite popular, and food that takes a very minimal amount of fuel to handle, to heat up or otherwise, or just eat cold. So I think this is part of the transition that's really critical to understand. In a place like Kibera and the other big slums in Kenya and Africa, East Africa, we really see a lot of vendors that have paid the cost but consumed created a huge volume of fat and so on. And so they can by producing a huge volume of food for the same oil and fat, they save money for other people.
Richard, I just wanted to
yes.
make a contribution here. So
Yeah.
this is where I'd also like to share some of the findings from our work. You know, when we talk about those nuances and those differences we see with the dietary transition. You remember I mentioned that within the communities that we studied, eating at home was still a major part of their lifestyle. And that's really similar to what I found amongst Ghanaian immigrants in the UK. So they hardly eat out of home. So for those minority or that peculiar case, recommendations we have made is think about ways that a traditional food can be prepared such that it is, you know, it's similar to the fast food in terms of fast. So it's a bit convenient because it takes time to cook these traditional foods. It takes hours and hours to prepare these foods. You know, so for people who would ordinarily still want to eat the traditional foods, they might just take those foods because of convenience. So researchers, academics, and people who work in this area need to think of ways in which we can prepare recipes like the work you do, Richard, where our long hours of cooking could be reduced to prepare those traditional meals. So we retain the nutrients, the taste, but it's done in, less time as compared to what we have at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
And that's really, Richard, really done by creating more healthy food that's been semi-processed before it's being sold in different stores, so that you have kind of prepared salads, or you have prepared the dish for whatever kind of cornmeal stew you want, and it'll all be there, and then you just have to do the cooking. And this is happening more and more across the globe.
Yeah, I was going to ask Dr. Bragg, are you seeing any innovations coming from the food industry itself in terms of, especially the very big multinationals, instead of, I mean, we talked about Coke and water and so on, but are there examples of better foods coming from the multinationals?
There are examples of companies acquiring better food brands and then letting them dwindle and, sort of not flourish and die on the vine, you could say. But there are, especially through my work with the Aspen Food Leaders Fellowship, there are some promising examples of groups who are trying to create environments where the healthier brands can flourish, and trying to and there it's a small group of those people, but but thinking about supporting vegetable farmers and some of those types of products that they're producing, and so I think that is promising, but I think it's a drop in the bucket compared to what these countries can do. And I think the more concerning thing that we see them doing is hijacking a cultural food and maybe infusing it, or associating it with something like Coca-Cola. So if you're going to have a traditional meal, have it alongside a Coca-Cola, and so that is much more common than anything we see that would be promising.
Yeah. Starting around 15, 20 years ago, the global food companies started creating what they call better for you or healthier foods, but they really weren't healthy. They still used highly refined grains and so forth. What they did was maybe cut the sugar or say it was natural, but it really wasn't natural because they had processed the nature so much that it was unnatural, ultra-processed food. And so this is going on, and this appeals to higher income people in countries. Even throughout Africa, I've seen some of these foods in retail outlets. So, but it's not going to be anything for the masses, and it's not truly any healthier. It just may have a little less sodium, a little less sugar, or organic fruits that are put into it, but it's still processed up, and it's not healthier.
Now, we have a question here from John Kiragu, just talking about, and his question really is about GM foods. Now, I know this may be a little bit out of what we were going to discuss, but the issue here is, do GM foods have a role in addressing health in terms of the nutrition transition. And just a comment about safety. So I don't know who wants to go first on this.
I'll take it on because I've had
food.
to. I'll take it on because I've had to deal with it. Ultra GM foods are the bulk of ultra processed foods today. They're the higher productivity grains and so forth. And all the studies that have been done globally have not found any health impact from them. That indeed, they're just using genetics to speed up the process that used to take decades. We used to put together different genes and grow crops over, and it would take like a year, and then we may splice together two products and keep growing it and keep trying to create something healthier. But now we can do with rice, corn, soybeans, so many wheat of different sorts, we can genetically put together and do in a year what it would take us 15 years before to do. And we can test them out. But it hasn't truly changed. They talk in the GM world of Frankenstein foods that sometimes take a gene from something else and put it in, but that gene makes it drought resistant. And so it really hasn't manipulated the product, but it's changed the root in a way that it digs deeper and finds soil, and it doesn't need as much water. And we're creating flood-resistant, drought-resistant products in a year when it took decades before. So no, we have no health studies that show they're bad. And in most of the ultra-processed foods of the world today, they're genetically modified. Even some of the red palm oil to speed up the productivity and grow it quicker, the trees have been modified in many ways. So it affects us in ways we'll never know. And all the health studies have not found. They've tested on mice, they've tested on humans, they've done long studies on it. We don't have any negative effects, but the fear of Frankenstein foods is what they've created in the public in many cases, particularly one group of people who pushed this in Western Europe and stopped some of the GM products for a while getting into Western Europe. It's pretty much over now. But so that's what GM products are.
Yeah. So the issue really is more about the ultra processed foods rather than the initial thing in itself.
Yeah,
right?
I think I agree with that completely.
Yeah.
It's the ultra processed food and the highly processed foods and all the extra frying that we're doing and the adding of all the salt and so on. It's all of this stuff that's really creating unhealthy food. And sugary beverages leads the way because it doesn't affect what we eat. So we used to drink water or maybe tea and coffee, depending on the culture. And we've shifted. And now we have calorie drinks. And it doesn't affect the rest of our diet. So we're adding extra calories to a diet we have already.
Yeah. I mean, one of the trends I see is with a lot of people is around these high energy drinks. And they have like 2-3 times the amount of sugar that even a Coke has in the first place. There's a question here about food fortification. Whether is it a good thing in the long run?
If the fortification is adding scarce vitamin A, other nutrients that we need, for example, dealing with women in pregnancy, we add niacin to the many grains and other things in many countries. It's positive. It doesn't hurt at all, and it often will address deficiencies in the country. We used to have in Africa, particularly a lot of iodine deficiency and vitamin A in certain regions, aside from the ones that had the red palm oil, which is pretty high in A. And we've used different fortification methods to remove these problems. We fortify iron in many cases and others. And while it may be less available than having certain sources of iron like meat, it has helped. And we see no negatives from fortification.
I'll toss in a negative, Barry. What about when vitamins are added to Coca-Cola, or
Right.
and so there's a risk factor there where it creates people think, okay, I'm getting my vitamins with my Coke, and so the one caveat I would argue is when they pump it into foods that are horrible for us.
That's correct. That's not called fortification. Fortification is providing missing elements in our diet that we need to be healthier.
And I think that distinction is so critical here, because a lot of times I think when consumers think about fortifying their own diet, they might think if they're getting their, some extra vitamins in their sugary cereal, that's sort of fortifying something that they're missing, but that's not the case.
Exactly.
Yeah. So just to ask all the listeners who are in, if they have any questions, if they can put it in the chat, because we're about to start to come to the end. So I'm going to be asking the panelists to give us some closing statement of about 2 or 3 minutes each. But before we get to that, in terms of public communication campaigns, or even in media, are there any that have been shown to work? I'll start with UK, Ghana, Kenya. Dr. Osei Kwasi.
Right. Okay. So there's evidence to show that nutrition education, those kinds of lifestyle interventions work, but it is on short term. When they do the evaluation over 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, there's always, that positive change, but long-term impact, I don't know of evidence to show the long-term impact of those educational campaigns. And so when I talk about solutions, I'm like, education is not the solution for the Ghanaian immigrant community that I'm working with, because they will tell you that they know, so it's not the way to go to get people. It could be part of the solution, but we need beyond education, is what I would say.
Okay. Dr. Bragg, you concur?
We do have campaigns. We do have campaigns in the US, and they're advertising campaigns. And so the idea that our nutrition education or our nutrition programming in the US is largely driven by the thousands of ads that we see for these sugary drinks, fast food, candy brands. And so it goes back to that idea, anything that's going to try to compete with that is going to be totally drowned out. And so rather than sort of thinking about public campaigns for nutrition, we really need to be thinking about how do we unravel the campaigns that are already going on that we know work in terms of driving people towards sugary drink purchases and the like.
Okay. Dr. Popkins, you are going to make a comment?
No, I'm gonna leave it there.
I think the thing about this, the whole nutrition transition is about people eating too much and eating the wrong foods. So advertising, trying to do a campaign that says don't eat, it's kind of a difficult one, competing with all these adverts that are talking about eat, this and that and the other. Okay. So I'm just reading a comments here that public communication can serve as a citizens engagement tool. This from Diana Wangari, especially on social media, and that might ultimately lead to some political pressure. I think it's a comment more than a question.
I think that
and we use, sorry, Marie, we
Sorry,
use
yeah.
social media in our advocacy campaigns to get front of the package labeling laws, to get taxes and other things. And so social media is a critical positive if you're pushing for the right kind of cause. And so it's not always a negative, but it's a negative in the way the food industry has come in and capitalized on it and created these Frankenstein databases on everybody and everybody in a family, and then uses that to manipulate children and adolescents.
Yep, Dr. Bragg, you adding?
I'll just say, well said.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a question about women empowerment and about women entering the workforce in Africa, and then this buying of highly processed foods and time to cook is decreasing. I have my own answer to the question about how to address it, but Dr. Osei Kwasi?
Richard, I think it goes back to the comment I made earlier about us developing, some of these easy to make recipes, so that traditionally in most African countries, women are in charge of cooking. And yes, today we all have, we work as much as our men counterparts, but women are still in charge of the cooking and taking care of the home. So how can we ensure that we still cook healthy meals? So I'll go back to that point I made earlier, that we need to start thinking about finding ways to prepare some of those healthy recipes. And I think Barry made a good point about getting some of those, do I call them staples, processed a bit, not over processed, but made in such a way that once we use it, it cuts down the cooking time. That would be my input into this.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I was going to say my solutions are, I love cooking. So in my case, it really isn't an issue about...
right. And I'm very much the same, but that's unique. It's very unique times that men get involved in home preparation, any kind of home production, be it cooking, childcare, cleaning, washing, laundry, etc. So it's needed, but it doesn't exist in Africa.
It doesn't exist, yeah. So we've had a discussion. I mean, we've talked a lot about what the problem is and what some of the broader policy solutions are there. And then we sort of said, this is really not about an individual effort. It isn't about particular families, even though because a lot of them will know that it is a problem. It is, what should they do? So there's a question here about using celebrities' endorsements, trying to get them on board. I mean, Africa is big on sports as well. Is that something? I think you kind of know what the answer is, but there's a how. Yeah.
Can I come in here? So something I wanted to mention earlier, but I forgot, in terms of solutions and what is working. In Ghana, just a couple of days ago, I saw a news item that there's been, there was a FDA, so Food and Drugs Board, went to court about banning celebrities who were involved in promoting alcoholic drinks, and they've won the case. So that's a plus for Ghana. This is not being done for sweetened beverages yet. So that could be one way, because we do know that people look up to these celebrities. In Ghana, recent evidence showed that lots of people have about sugar sweetened beverages like more than 3 times in a week. And most of them just watch these celebrities. So that would be a way to go. And I just wanted to say kudos to the Ghanaian government, for doing that. Hopefully that could be extended to some of these foods that we are fighting at the moment. Yeah. So I think it's a plus to use celebrities to fight this. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you shared that example, Dr. Osei Kwasi, because I would love to find that article and start to put it into slides, because I think your excitement about sharing that example ties into a lot of our work on celebrity endorsements, because they are often the trendsetters, for cultural norms. And years ago, athletes used to endorse tobacco. So there would be a picture of an athlete holding a cigarette, and now that seems so odd and doesn't really happen. And it became a public relations liability to endorse tobacco. And tying into Diana's comment about Gen Z and social media activism, I think there is an opportunity for celebrities to shift what they are endorsing and refrain from endorsing junk foods. The problem is, if one endorsement deal with a soda company gives you $10 million and you can sort of support your entire family for, a couple generations, it's very hard to turn down. And so I always try to say, we don't necessarily want to overly criticize only the athletes. We do want to encourage them to change their behavior, but it's the companies, like Barry was saying earlier, the companies make water. They could, and we know that some celebrity athletes like Steph Curry endorse Brita water filters. And so that's an example of, and he did it on purpose because it was a healthy beverage. And so there are some glimmers of hope there, but it's going to be really hard to do unless the companies can sort of put their money behind getting athletes to promote things like water.
Okay, so thank you. So we're coming to the end. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists to just give them sort of final comments, 3 minutes or so, or less. So I'll start with you, Dr. Osei Kwasi, and then move over to Dr. Bragg and finish off with Dr. Popkin. And I'll get half a bite of the cherry just to say that what I've got from this in terms of the nutrition transition is that in the long term, basketball players are going to grow shorter. Yeah. But yeah, so Dr. Say?
Yes, thanks, Richard. I think we've talked a lot about this, thanks to people like Professor Barry. There's a lot already out there about nutrition transition. We know what the issues are. We need solutions. And for us to get these solutions, we need government commitment. We need all stakeholders to come on board for us to be able to address this at the multiple levels. Again, I just want to highlight the Ghanaian government, who over the past, and I'm only mentioning the Ghanaian government because a lot of my research is based in Ghana. Over the past decade, the government has demonstrated political commitment to prevent NCDs. Some of the successes I would say I need to highlight are the fact that we now have the food-based dietary guidelines. Not all African countries have this. We have an excise duty amendment act, I think that was last year, that enacts a 20% tax on sugar sweetened beverages. We haven't done the evaluation, but we know that it's kind of helping in some countries. So hopefully this can help. I've also just talked about the celebrity endorsement that I think it's actually just today that I saw online for alcoholic drinks. So hopefully that could be extended to other drinks, So in ending, what I'm just saying is that we need more political will and support from, other stakeholders. Ghana government is doing its best. And so we hope that other governments can join in this fight. And that's the only way we can help address this problem in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dr. Bragg?
I think that the work that Barry and others have done in other countries really serve as a model for how to start to tackle these issues of marketing and labeling and thinking about the behavior of companies and how they're shaping our dietary patterns. And so learning lessons from some of those success stories about restricting ads for long periods of time on TV is a really valuable one. And I think this idea that social media as a really sophisticated marketing tool that is going to sort of just add fuel to the fire that the industry already has going to shape consumer preferences is something we need to get a handle on. Right now, in this moment, there is widespread concern about the damage that social media does on the mental health of young people. And so if we can continue to sort of infuse concerns about the marketing aspect of it alongside that mental health concern, we can sort of maximize the benefits to people in terms of dismantling the sort of marketing angle of social media. I will say, as my sort of closing thought on the social media piece, they don't exist without advertising. They're not social media networking. They're not networking tools. They're advertising tools. That's why they were designed, and it's the primary purpose of them. And so we can't overlook that as part of the package of what's shaping our food norms.
Thank you for that. Dr. Popkin?
I agree with what both of our colleagues have said before me. We're in a global fight against the global food companies and against the food industry in general, which is actually killing us. And with the food they're selling us. And we need to have everybody focus on pushing governments to get in place some of these regulations we know work, and we're slowly pushing forward the frontier. But we've only been doing these regulations for a decade. It took, in the area of tobacco, 60 years to accomplish what we've accomplished with sugary beverage taxes and some other areas in just a decade. So people know, government ministers of health know the costs they're facing, and it's getting them on our side, and then it's getting not civil society, individuals to push their government to do the right thing. And that's not easy to do. We've got the food industry in their pockets trying to find all the ways they can to fight us. And so, but countries are moving. Many countries are trying to do the right things, and we just need more African countries now. I've got at least 4 countries in Africa, aside from South Africa, working on front of the package labeling. We need them to put in the right kind of labels, warning labels that impact food purchasing and not labels that industry wants. So all I want to say is there's a future that we need to build to create a healthier Africa.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for participating. So first of all, I'd like to thank the participants who have come and listened in, but it wouldn't have happened without our panelists. So Dr. Hiba Osei-Kwasi, thank you very much for giving us time and for enlightening us on the work that you're doing. Dr. Marie Bragg as well. And of course, Dr. Barry Popkin, a real special thanks. Dr. Osei-Kwasi and Dr. Bragg, you allow me just to say something about Dr. Popkin in the sense that you saw his biography and we're all familiar with him. In my household, like I said, he's quite famous from quite early on. So I had a personal influence in terms of what it is that we've been eating. So thank you very much. I'll take it. I'm going to go brag to my family.
Yeah. Richard, I did the same with a poster, shared it with everybody.
There you are.
I'm
there
a
you are.
panelist with. Yeah. So
yes.
we share the same thing.
The same. Okay, thank you. And to thank the Aspen Institute as well, Kenya. So Dr. Macharia, Mukuya as well. Thank you very much for putting this together. So back to you, Mukuya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aya, and all of our panelists for such a really illuminating discussion. It was so interesting. Thank you. At the Aspen Initiative Africa, we'll continue to host these thought-provoking and enlightening dialogues that are data-driven. We'd like you to follow us on our social media handles for event updates and engaging conversations on X, formerly Twitter, at Aspen Africa, and on our LinkedIn, Aspen Initiative Africa. So we hope to see you at our next event or gathering. Thank you very much and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.